Hello, apes, and welcome. This is chapter 6, and we are talking about ethics and economics and sustainable development. And this is the third screencast. And in the last screencast, we were introducing ourselves to uh, three perspectives of ethics, and we looked at the anthropocentrisms, and that's where, it's just people that are important. And then we looked at biocentrism, and that includes people, but it also does include other organisms and species that are held important. And then ecocentrism includes everything as important, and including all of this. And you can kind of tell by the way that the picture is done, it is more inclusive, and that everything has value to it. And that's one of the things that we have to think about is how do people value things? When you have a value to it, then you're going to want to protect it and to sustain it. Uh, let's take a look at Christianity and Christianity's attitude toward the environment. Okay, that's the first one that we're Okay, and I'm looking at page 137 in your book, and I have some things highlighted, so I'm going to be reading from that. It says that environmental ethics arose as an academic discipline in the 1970s. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato argued that humanity had a moral obligation to our environment. He wrote that the land is our ancestral home and we must cherish it even more than children cherish their mother. Okay, so Plato even thought that it was important to um, protect our environment, that we had an obligation to protect it. Um, Ethicists and theologians pointed out that religious traditions like Christianity and Judaism and Islam were sources of the anthropocentric hostility toward the environment. They pointed out that biblical passages that said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have domain over the fish in the sea, and over birds in the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." So, according to the wording that people had read, scholars encourage animosity and disregard toward nature. That was the idea that they were getting from those readings. Um, when you interpret the sacred texts of these religions to encourage benevolent human stewardship over nature, uh, they could consider the directive, "You shall not defile the land in which you live." If one views the natural world as God's creation, then surely it must be considered as sinful to degrade that creation. So they were looking to the Bible to defend how they treated the earth. So along comes the Industrial Revolution, and that Industrial Revolution increased our consumption of our natural resources. We were able to farm and destroy land for our needs at a faster rate, and we pollute it at a faster rate. So the Industrial Revolution amplified the human impacts to the environment, and agricultural economies became industrial ones. Machines enhanced or replaced human and animal labor, and many people moved from farms to cities. Populations rose dramatically, consumption of natural resources accelerated, and pollution was intensified as we burned coal to fuel railroads and steamships, ironworks and factories, and heat our own homes. John Ruskin, who was a British critic, said that cities were little more than laboratories for the distillation into heaven of venomous smokes and smells. So he basically said that people were no longer appreciating nature because our consumption of nature. Ruskin worried that while people prized the material benefits that nature provided, they no longer appreciated its spiritual and aesthetic benefits. In the United States in the 1840s, a movement started called Transcendentalism, and this was a philosophical movement that asserted that nature is a manifestation of the divine. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he was from New England and a philosopher, as well as Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman, poets as well. They were transcendentalists, and their view was that nature, as a direct manifestation of the divine, emphasized the soul's oneness with nature and God. They objected to an attraction to material things, and they promoted a holistic view of nature in which natural entities were symbols of messengers of deeper truths. Thoreau, as we said, viewed nature as divine. He also observed the natural world closely and came to understand it in a manner of scientists, and he considered that he was one of the first ecologists. And then he wrote his book Walden. I think you've talked about that in English classes, and recorded his observations and thoughts while he was living on Walden Pond, away from the bustle of the urban Massachusetts. And this still remains one of the classical pieces of literature. So the 20th century opened conservation and preservation of our natural resources, and the preservation ethic grew, and we viewed that unspoiled nature should be protected for its own intrinsic value. So there was value despite it. John Muir, who lived between 1838 and 1914, was a Scottish immigrant to the United States. He lived in California's Yosemite Valley, and he made the wilderness his home. He chose to live in isolation in Sierra Nevada, and he became politically active and won fame as a tireless advocate for the preservation of the wilderness. He was motivated by the rapid deforestation and environmental degradation, and he believed that the natural world should be treated with the same respect that we give our cathedrals. So this is where that preservation ethic came from. It holds that we should protect natural environment in a pristine, unaltered state, that we shouldn't do anything to harm it. He was an ecocentrist, and his argument was resting on the notion of intrinsic value, but he also maintained that nature promoted human happiness. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, and places to play and pray where nature may heal and give strength to the body and soul alike. Okay, so that was his thinking. Then came the conservation ethic, and this was the view that people should use natural resources wisely for the greatest good for most people. This fit the utilitarian standard with that. And we hear of Gifford Pinchot, who was alive between 1865 and 1846. And he was the first professionally trained American forester. And he started the U.S. Forest Service and served as its chief at the request of President Theodore Roosevelt. He opposed the deforestation and unregulation of economic development, and then this developed the conservation ethic, which holds that people should put natural resources to use, but that we have a responsibility to manage them wisely. It does employ a utilitarian standard, and it allocates resources to provide the greatest good to the greatest number of people for the longest time. Pinchot and Muir came to represent different branches of the American environmental movement that are in place today. But despite their individual differences, here's a look at those two men. Despite their differences, they really represented reactions against the prevailing development ethic. So they had that as a commonality. And this development ethic holds that people should be masters of nature and promote economic development without regard, despite negative consequences with that. People worldwide are now wrestling with how to balance preservation, conservation, and economic development. Okay. Another name that we hear about is Aldo Leopold, and he comes up with a land ethic that really was inspirational to many people. We see him living in 1887 through 1949. He began his career as a conservationist, and he graduated from Yale University, and he helped Pinchot found, just as Roosevelt and Pinchot were advancing the conservation on the national stage, and he embraced the government policy of shooting predators like wolves to increase populations of deer and other game animals. He followed the development of ecological science and ceased to view certain species as good or bad, but instead came to see that there was a healthy ecological balance, a system that depended on the protection of all of their interacting parts and not just a few. And he said that you had to keep every cog in wheel, and that's the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. Leopold argued that people should view themselves and the land as members of the same community, and that we are obligated to treat the land in an ethical manner, and then develop the land ethic that he wrote about in a 1949 essay. This this land ethic that he wrote had a few points, and he said that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts, and we've talked about interdependency before. He said that the land ethic changes the role of humans from conqueror of the land and community, and he implies that they need to have respect for the fellow members and respect for the community, which means the other organisms that are involved in it. And he said that a thing has a right, and when it tends to preserve the integrity and stability and beauty of the biotic community, then that's where its right comes from. Okay, so we're 14 minutes in. We're going to end this screencast, and then we'll continue talking about the environmental justice seeking equal treatment for all races and classes.